Our next speaker this afternoon is Dan Brinkmeier, former colleague of mine from the Field Museum. Dan is an artist and educator. He bridges the fields of journalism and mass communication, visual art, and rural sociology. He works in the area of visual communication for rural development as applied to environmental conservation and documenting the world's biodiversity using visual media to transfer technical or scientific information to targeted audiences in the lowland tropics of South America. He has projects in Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador, and I had the unique opportunity of working with him last summer in Bolivia. It was very, very educational. In addition, he provides training for scientific staff in museums and research institutions in Cuba, Uganda, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. He began working at the Field Museum full-time in 1987, designing and building exhibits, managing educational outreach programs for Chicago schools, and finally taking on a position in environmental conservation programs in 1998. He is still a fellow at the Field Museum of Natural History here in Chicago. Dan also works with conservation planning services in Mount Carroll, Illinois. Today he will be presenting a case study, United States and Latin America. His talk is titled Local Agriculture, International Markets, Global Pressures, Case Studies from America's Heartland. Please join me in welcoming Dan Brinkmeier.
Good afternoon. I was going to say, what was I just going to say? I hope this will be entertaining for you. This was actually rather interesting for me to put this together because unlike I think many of the people you'll be hearing from during this, I'm not really an expert on marketing or economics, that type of a thing, but I thought if anything I would bring kind of a different kind of perspective to this, which is someone who is from a farm in Illinois and is actually returning to the farm. One of the reasons why I decided to semi-retire from the Field Museum was actually to go back home and work in conservation, but work with individual landowners. I've been doing that so many years in other countries that I finally said, why don't I go back and see what's going on where I'm from and where I'm, actually on my own farm. So, it didn't seem right after a while. So. Anyway, so this has been a rather, like I say, a rather interesting thing for me just to put something together. And so I could have done a couple of things. There are a lot of facts and figures and things like that. I probably could have. I did find, and I had some things of my own to begin with. But I said, why don't I just show you some pictures? And the idea is that I want to kind of show you a little bit about how this affects people here in the United States and the world. I guess the market links that we have. That everybody sort of knows they are there. People actually do talk about it, but it's sort of one of those categories that we just don't know much. And one of the things you also have to understand, in rural areas, you get outside the city, information sources are rather limited. The times now that I've been spending more at home, and it's just kind of maddening in a way. We have access to one small newspaper. You listen, the radio is pretty much horrible. It's all AM. I'm going to actually become quite a Rush Limbaugh fan. Not really, but anyway. Again, it's not necessarily the fault of people out in rural areas for not really knowing what's going on. They just don't have the same access to information and media sources as people here do. That's improving a little bit, but again, we don't even have internet on my own my family farm. So I have to go into town to the town library and sit in front, in my car and hook into their wireless. To check my email when I'm out there. So anyway, let me get started. And the other thing is I want to make sure that is again, I may just start talking, and if you have questions, please ask me what those are. I'll try to get through this. Anyway, let me start this. So what I did was also I thought about these are the learning objectives. I was really looking for this idea of what are the linkages that we have here in the Midwest in farm country on farms with the world market, because it actually it's huge. It really is. Again, it's one of those things that everybody sort of knows is there. One of the things that over the years that when I come home and I talk to people, and I've never really lost a lot of my links with home, with the farm. It's a family farm, and I grew up there. But everybody's, you've been to Cuba? Oh, I wish they'd buy more soybeans from us. It really is about that. You know what I mean? When it comes down to it, or why don't in Africa, why don't those people buy more grain? You know, well, they do actually get a lot of U.S. grain, but not necessarily buying it. But and also the understanding a little bit about this historical change. My background, again, is more of if anything, I did go to graduate school at Iowa State University, and I was in rural sociology there. And a lot of what it was in the early 80s during really one of the periods when we had a farm crisis, and I did learn a lot and still think a lot about this historical change that we've been going through here in Midwestern agriculture and how it affects us. And of course that idea of raising food for the world. And this is, again, is something you'll hear again and again in the media. Just the other day I heard an ad for the John Deere Museum. Has anyone been down to the John Deere Museum down in the Quad Cities? You know, and it's a nice museum, but again, at least twice during the ad they said how U.S. farmers feed the world. You know, I mean, it's just something that's sort of drilled into people's heads. After a while, people start to, well, that's what we're doing here. You know, we're feeding the world. And again, it's actually a task. I mean, it actually is a real thing. How are we going to feed? How is someone going to feed a population that they say is going to grow to 8 or 9 billion fairly soon? And then, of course, the one thing I have to touch on, which was a big deal in the last couple of years, and you could see this everywhere in just about everything, was this ethanol issue. And this is a tough one because, you know, you can find one website that's for it, you can find the next website that's against it. All the farm media, which we read out there, the Illinois Agri-News, Progressive Farmer, they're all obviously for it. And so, you know, you can cook the figures about just about anything you want. Depends on, you know, whether you know, what side you're on. So, but anyway, but I tend to go on, and I'll show you a few things I found. And then, of course, really about this, I want to show some of the consequences and of what we see here, the social costs. And again, it's interesting. Sabina, the prior speaker, was saying the economics, doesn't have morals. You know, when we got, you know, this idea, and when you think about things like ethanol making fuel out of a food source, and for many people really probably should be an ethical issue, but that's something that doesn't. I haven't noticed it enters into the discourse very much, though. And then again, this thing about what we can or can't do about it. And actually, to tell you the truth, I don't know if there is much we can do about it. We're sort of on a railroad train here, and this has been going on for 30, 40 years. I'm talking about the changes in Midwestern agriculture, and it's a little difficult to stop this train we're on right now. At least we know about it. And again, overall, the thing as a person who I have spent a lot of my career, one of my specialties has been in soil conservation. And when I tend to go and look at this, I tend to think about the environmental issues, number one. And again, when it comes down to what we're talking about with agriculture today, it really is about this pressure that we have now. It's not just producing grains for food, but it's also for fuel, and which is a pressure on the market. And then the other thing we have, the other side, which is this what's the issue with our land productivity? And there's a lot of issues going on with that. So we sort of have a conflict. There's a built-in conflict here. And again, just as a contextual thing, I am from Mount Carroll, Illinois. I was born there. It's in Carroll County, which is, if you follow North Avenue out, turns into Route 64. You wouldn't want to do that. It'd take you forever, but, you know what I mean, because but anyway, but eventually 64 will go through Mount Carroll. We're just 8 miles east of the Mississippi. And so I kind of grew up, you know, always in that area and on a farm. My father also was a soil agronomist. He worked for the University of Illinois Extension Service, so I kind of saw it from both sides as a farmer, and also the side which is informing farmers about new practices. In other words, we were, you know, probably part of this change that we went through over the years. Excuse me. Put this right here. And the other thing I was going to add too is that Carroll County is a county that's a pretty small population. It's not one of the poorest counties in Illinois. There's some in southern Illinois that are quite more economically advantaged, but we don't have any industry. Agriculture is really sort of the only thing that we have had going there until recently, with the kind of a boom, with interest in tourism, that kind of a thing. And but I'll talk about that, and I'll also come back to this what our things are going on with our farm, and I'll explain what's going on there. But that's my family, and I still going back and I'm making hay again and, learning, some new skills. It means work in a field again. And I thought I'd start off with this. We're talking about markets, and this is something that's a true story. Maybe some of you remember this. Maybe some of you don't know it. I don't know how you feel about Oprah Winfrey, but this is it's not an international, well, actually it is an international market issue because it did affect the international market as well. But my parents up there were small farmers. We always had a small cow herd where we raised the calves and then we would sell them. Well, everybody does this. I mean, when you look especially at northwestern Illinois, which is unglaciated, eastern Iowa, southern Iowa, down into Illinois, you find farms that have like areas of marginal land that are really just suitable only for pasture, and so you have these small cattle operations. And these people really, they work hard to keep these calves alive and to feed them and, raise a few calves or whatever. So, and this is a true case. I think it was April 16th, 1996, a fateful day. My mom and my dad, they loaded, something like 25 calves into their trailer, and we always sold them at the market, the cattle market, kind of like international trade over in eastern Iowa, over at Macokota. They had to cross the Mississippi River, and they loaded them up and took them over there. About the time that they were driving over there, Oprah was on. And what do you think that Oprah said? She said, just something, it was actually a show about mad cow disease and the unsafe practices, and really there hadn't been a case of mad cow disease in the United States, but basically it came out that this was a danger, and she said she would never eat another hamburger or just stopped her cold from eating another burger. The market plummeted. And my parents leave the calves off. They get the check the next day. They lost like 20 cents, pound per calf. And just really kind of like, wow, how could this happen? I mean, it's just basically they didn't understand. I mean, how could what someone said on television, do this to them? And I mean, in some cases, Oprah was sued by the some of the cattlemen's operation or the associations, that kind of a thing. But I think what it kind of teaches you is that the market's fickle, and there's other cases for this as well. I think I put this up here as well. Oh yeah, swine flu. Anybody heard of that? Yeah, this has been driving them nuts. The Illinois Farm newspapers or whatever keep talking about this. No matter what they do, they cannot get people to understand that this doesn't come from pigs. And yet, so it's really affected the pork prices in terms of the market. They're talking about, on average, hogs in the United States were worth like $20 less per hog. Just because people like, well, no, it's swine flu. So these markets are fickle. They're based on misperceptions, what people hear, that kind of a thing. It doesn't take Oprah Winfrey necessarily just to do it. Especially when you talk about some of our major trading partners, Mexico, and they basically have cut down many of their imports. And then, of course, don't remember this. I was sitting there and I was thinking, wait a minute. I know of a case where there was a huge hit on the grain markets. Jimmy Carter. Who actually was a pretty nice guy, whatever. But, remember when the Russians invaded Afghanistan way back in, the day? Well, basically Jimmy Carter came out with a grain embargo. I remember this. There were farmer protests. There were people driving tractors into Chicago. They were dumping grain, like down in front of the Board of Trade. I mean, there was all these protests. People were really ticked off. Ronald Reagan kind of won on the basis. He said he's going to immediately get rid of the embargo if he was elected, and he was elected the next election. But and the thing about this that's rather interesting is this right here. When they talk about the consequences of the Russian grain embargo, actually it really started to spur this dramatic growth in South America's agricultural production, because there are areas of the world where people are able to ramp up production. They do have resources. They say, well, okay, there's a market there. It's not being covered by someone else because of something. And that's actually, they can go back and they can look at some of the, there was already Amazonian deforestation, but on a much, much larger scale starting about this time. I'm not saying this is a smoking gun, but they actually start to look at this. So anyway, and the other thing that people remember about this is that for the first time, farmers still even talk about, remember that when the government got involved and they went and they had a grain, well, the idea is that the government's working against people. They have this incredible control over things, whatever, and it's making U.S. grain kind of undependable, for the first time in the world market. So these types of things, these kind of memories kind of die hard for people. And they still, people will talk about this almost. I know it's almost like it's happened yesterday. The other thing I was going to talk a little bit about our environment here also I think it was Sabina talked about what absolute advantage, whatever. Wouldn't this be our absolute advantage over the rest of the world? We're blessed here with having some of the best land, prairie soils in central United States for growing crops. Yeah, and that's because of these very, very deep prairie soils that we have. And that doesn't necessarily mean that all the areas outside of that aren't in agricultural production as well, because we do grow obviously a lot of corn in northwestern Illinois and southwest Wisconsin. It's not, but we have some very, very good soils here. This kind of basically corresponds roughly to this the world's oldest map I found of the grain belt. Here that's probably from the 40s, something like that, and it doesn't exactly match up with this. Yeah.
When I read Michael Pollan talks about the heavy presence of fossil fuel fertilizers in the soil, and we talk about the best soil. I'm wondering, well, are they using land and its soil, or are they using all these fertilizers that really, the whole notion of the soil is really...
It's the organic matter, the natural organic matter that's 20 inches deep that's in these prairie soils that's been built up as a process of, thousands of years. Is what we're basically, that's our capital. Is what you're talking about. Yeah. Okay, we'll get to that. Yeah. No, that's right. Yeah, because, we'll talk about that. But there's a natural organic, again, an absolute advantage that we have here that many areas of the world do not have, and that is what's that?
The whole state of Iowa is...
Southern Iowa is not that great. That's more like cattle country, that kind of a thing, but it still falls within the, listen, this is like from the 40s. Maybe I just found this, I didn't draw this one. So some of the drawings you'll see here I actually drew, but I didn't draw this one. Yeah, but you're right. I think it's spotty. There are spotty areas within this and that don't have the same soil types. Soils are one of the most complicated sciences, by the way, of any of the natural sciences. Soils are incredibly complicated because of the glaciers. They mixed everything up, and you'll find areas that have poor soils right next to areas of incredibly fertile soils, that kind of a thing. I'm not going to get into that right now. Yeah. And again, one thing that we always get asked, and many of you already know this, is what is all that corn out there when you're driving down the interstate? Well, Illinois, that's field corn. It's not sweet corn, and there's a huge, huge difference. And the other thing is that most of this still is fed to livestock. However, it may not be fed to livestock here in the United States. It may be shipped out, right, to other areas of the world, especially now that we have multinational companies that are owning like large hog production facilities in Mexico, for example, or in other countries. And so that 50% fed to livestock figure isn't necessarily here in the United States. A large amount of it is exported to other countries within a number of programs, and then 25% of that, probably a little bit less, really, that's kind of high, goes to ethanol production. And these are figures come from the Illinois Farm Bureau.
What percent of the total corn production is for food for...
What percent of the total?
Corn production.
Well, according to this, it's 50. Yeah.
No, but this is field corn.
Yes.
Percent of full corn.
Oh, you mean, well, there's only field corn and sweet corn. There's the corn that we eat as humans, and that's sweet corn. Yeah.
Percent of the total corn.
Oh, boy, I bet you sweet corn isn't that much. Yeah, it's pretty small. It's kind of spot. It's like certain areas produce sweet corn. That's like a different, to set up, to harvest that, that's a whole nother, it's higher labor. It's a whole nother thing. It's a much, much smaller percentage. This is huge amounts of money. We're talking about millions of bushels per acre, or bushels. And the other thing is, I thought I'd throw in, because a lot of the land out there is also in soybeans as well. And I'm mainly going to talk about corn, I think, today. But again, we exported more than a billion bushels in 2007. Yes.
What do we make high fructose corn syrup from? Field corn or sweet corn?
That's mostly from field corn. Yeah. Oh, yeah. See, a lot of it's like processed in that's your margarine, and they make plastics out of corn. Corn goes into so many different. Yeah, that's right. Coca-Cola, exactly. That's actually a really good project for students. Probably go into the store and give a prize for who can find the most products, come from corn. because it's in everything, and that's why when we'll get to the price rise thing or whatever, but yeah, that's why it does really impact everybody, and then of course, and the thing is, most people don't realize how many, both China and Mexico are importing more than 100 million bushels of soybeans per year. So soybeans is actually huge and that's most of that goes into animal feed, I guess. So. Okay, and then the other thing I thought I'd do is talk a little bit. Now I've talked about these these are the two main crops. Well, there has to be a way. There's like a system build up. There has to be a way to get them to market. We're past the old days when people were loading things in a wagon by hand and shoveling them out, whatever, and then just feed them to some cows down, of your own. This is basically the system is this huge thing that's been set up over the past really 30 years, something like that. It didn't take too long, but it's pretty streamlined, and everything comes back to the producer, and he may do it different ways, but you really want to get that corn in some way to a main terminal. Most of those are along the Mississippi. Has anyone here ever been to the Mississippi River Museum in Dubuque? Yeah, Jamie. Yeah. What's the main theme there? What did you come away with? What was the take-home thing? What's that? Waterways all feed into one, yeah. But I don't know if you noticed that it's a museum that has all the donors, the people, the companies, and it's like all the barge companies. It's like Cargill. It's like all the grain marketing firms or whatever. Basically, the Mississippi River is one great big giant long like transportation highway that's maintained by the Army Corps engineers, paid for by U.S. taxpayers, right, to keep that product flowing. Everything actually is, most of the world's grain for world markets goes out through New Orleans. So you got to get down there on these barge systems, get to the terminals, goes out to the world. Some of the corn still goes to on-farm storage. You're driving along the highway, you can see people with their grain bins, and they basically store it there, and some of them dry it there because corn, when it comes out of a field, is usually fairly wet, and it does perish. It is a perishable commodity. If it's too wet, it'll actually spoil, it'll mold, and you're not going to get very much money for it. So people do have to dry it down using natural gas. Much of the corn actually goes to a kind of a middleman or a middle kind of like facility, which are grain facilities, these elevators that used to be in every town. Those are kind of falling by the wayside to some degree, and many cases, most people are, a lot of these guys own semis. I'll talk about them a little bit, but I have two cousins that farm part of our farm now, and they also have a semi that they make money off of. They haul everything else, but they basically they just put the corn when they combine it, they harvest it right into the semi, and they haul it right to the river themselves. So, that's actually a lot of people do that. You'll see a lot of these farms out there. You'll see a semi parked next to the barn or out behind the building, something like that. They're hauling their own grain. So they're even cutting out that middleman part of it too. Yeah. So the thing is, I guess when you think about this huge U.S. grain production system, it's amazing. We haven't had them for a while, but back in the 80s when we had these huge surpluses of corn, they were piling grain up like in football fields in front of the high school, and you go across Iowa and you see these big, they had so much grain that the elevators couldn't actually hold it, and that's because the markets were down. They didn't have the transportation. There were just these huge harvests. And one thing that you cannot separate this system from is this thing called U.S. foreign policy. It really depends on, and I won't get into this too much. There's a lot of debate about it. You probably have heard many of the criticisms about this, that the U.S. uses this grain as a way to curry favor for certain countries. It's part of their, they say, well, $25 million worth of aid to X, country, that could represent $5 million worth of grain that's being shipped as surplus grain to that country as well. And there's a big criticism of, because many other countries that donate aid internationally do it as cash, and that's much more obviously preferable because this grain they comes in and they're like, well, what are we going to do with this? Some of it comes in the form of powdered milk. And so what does that do to farmers in like Africa? whatever. Well, what's their incentive to actually have fresh milk when they dump all these other products, surplus products from the U.S., into their markets. So that's a whole other story. But maybe somebody's going to talk about that a little bit. But it is an issue. Most people, obviously, who are farmers here in the U.S. don't really think about that part. All they know is that grain's going somewhere. It's not something that most people are really thinking about, but they could. But again, it is definitely used as an instrument of foreign policy on a huge scale. And the other thing that I could talk probably an hour and a half about this, and maybe somebody will, this thing called the transnational grain merchants. And what's funny about this is it's until, I don't know, maybe 20 years ago, something like that, it really wasn't all that well known, like what was going on in its market, because it's so secretive. It's one of the biggest. Yeah, the Carroll family, and it's like a privately owned company that they kind of describe it as like almost like semi-governmental, quasi-public, whatever kind of almost companies or whatever, that nobody has really any idea about what they really own, how much money they're dealing in, that kind of a thing, and very, very secretive. The first one again is Cargill. You probably heard of that. It's family owned, yeah, And the other one is Continental, which again, somebody was. I heard about this a while back, and they were saying they really can't quite find out whether it's been, some of it's been sold to Cargill or not. It's like not public, you know what I mean? Or it's like hidden somewhere. I don't know. You would think that somewhere you would be able to find out, but. And then, of course, everybody knows Archer Daniels Midland. They're mostly who's known more for soybeans, but they also deal in a lot of corn as well. And again, these are the marketing companies who make sure, who actually handle it. It's really a transportation marketing system for getting that grain from the U.S. into a port in for example, in Kenya. That's how it there through these companies. And then there's Bunge, which is also huge. They actually own a large number of the elevators that the grain facilities on the Mississippi River. When people haul their grain from their farm field here in Illinois right to the river, they probably are dropping it off at a grain facility that's owned by Bunge. And Bunge actually has a lot of Asian connections as well, and it's huge. They deal also with a lot of rice as well in Asia. They say that, I don't know much about the Canadian Wheat Board, they say is kind of similar. It's kind of like a very secretive, you don't really know exactly what's going on. That's huge as well. And then the other thing about this or whatever that I really don't want to get into is it comes up all the time. People know about it, and that's the commodities trading that goes on, Chicago Board of Trade. And farmers know about this, and they basically, when people talk about it, they know, hey, wait a minute, somebody's like making money off of the paper that's related to a commodity that I'm selling. You know what I mean? But then it stops there. You know what I mean? That kind of a thing. They know. Some farmers actually trade, they obviously trade in the futures market. They do that. But they also lose money too. Remember, there's got to be a loser, if there's a winner. So, yeah. And the other thing that's kind of odd about this, and if people where I'm from understood irony, they would appreciate more, I think, the fact that a lot of commodity brokers, people with seats on the Board of Trade, buy farmland with their profits, and are actually farm owners as well. But those usually end up being like hunting reserves, things like that kind of a thing. Not too many of them are really interested in actually farming, but they do actually invest their profits in farmland. So anyway, I don't really want to get into that too much. That's something that many of you may know about, and I'm not an expert on that. I know as little as anybody else knows. So I think we'll talk about that. And the thing I do want to kind of concentrate on a little bit is the social change that's taken place because as we develop this system. And again, this was already started. I think Sabine or somebody was talking a little bit about, I think the first speaker was talking a little bit about World War II. And many people will go back to World War II as the first time that farmers were kind of identified or selected out as a group as being something other than just farmers, but being like part of the war effort and actually producers that are contributing to this thing that was really industry. And gradually up in about the 60s into the 70s, for the first time, kind of people started to think about farmers, really not just farmers, but they're agribusinessmen, or in the case of the government, they started to really look at this as just one more sector of U.S. industry, not a way of life, not as it had been really. Most farmers, they grew food for other people as well, but it was really it was higher than subsistence farming, but they raised a lot of food for themselves, and they basically sold off the extra. One time there was probably a farm in the United States that didn't have chickens, and they had eggs, and they basically made extra money off of selling eggs to people in town, to their neighbors, people that didn't have farms, that kind of a thing. And they sold the excess that they grew, on a small scale, and it was sort of like the perfect local market. And for the first time then, though, we're starting to talk about an actual government policy beginning in the 70s, which is like, let's change this a little bit. And one of the things that sort of drove this too, one of the consequences of that is I've heard this maybe 25 years ago. Some older farmers were talking about, nowadays these guys they're fitting the land to the machinery. It's not that, they're not, in other words, they're not buying machinery, right, that's to the scale of the land that you have. But basically, people buy machinery, and then you go in with bulldozer or whatever, and you basically change the landscape so you can turn around with a 36-row planter. That's what that is. See how many? Well, people used to farm with a 2-row, 4-row. We had a 4-row for years. 6 rows pretty good, but that's 36 rows.
That's one machine?
That's one machine. You pull, yeah, that's right. You make one pass, you plant 36 rows. You can whip through, a couple hundred acres of planting corn, and people go into fields and they're done in a day. They come back. They don't come back until they harvest corn in the fall. They don't need to. So this is an industry. This is mechanized farming at its purest. Does anybody have any idea what these machines cost? What this machinery costs? There's a great website called Tractor House. I'm not joking, and it's used, farm machinery. Everybody gets on there, and it's like browsing the Sears catalog, except for farmers. But it's all used machinery or whatever. But even a used planter like this is probably going to run you around $300,000. So we're talking about an economic scale. When you think about farmers, you're talking about people who have access and use a lot of money. That's right. A combine's $300,000 easily. And the thing is, now it's getting to the point. I still go to farm sales where people sell, consignment sales where they sell older farm equipment, that kind of a thing, and even smaller combines that are only 20 years old, something like that. They can't even get bids on them. Nobody wants them. They're not big enough for most people. So, yeah. What's that? You can, custom, yeah. You can buy a farm and you can have somebody put a crop in for you. You can have them come and they can combine it for you. That's right. You can do that. There's custom farming. People do that. Sure. Yep. And I always go back to this. This is sort of my Bible. You actually pass this around. This is a nice little, I bought this in a used bookstore in Iowa some years ago. It's called, DuPont put it out in early 50s, The Story of Farm Chemicals. And this is, basically, I love looking at this thing because it's sort of a snapshot in time. They looked at a farm, they looked at all the progress that people were making, and they kind of puts it in historical context. And these are a couple of things out of that. And basically, it's still back when farms were diversified. You look at that there. You look at that guy. This is like a guy who's farming like 100 acres in Pennsylvania or something. His name is Burkholder. And look at all the products he's growing there. He's got dairy cows. Looks like he's got a vegetable garden. He's raising some corn. He's got chickens for eggs. He's raising some small grains to sell. This is a true diversified farm. At the same time, look at the progress they're making. And I really like this because this actually, when they talk about progress on farms, everybody says, well, yeah, but it used to be a lot of work. And why don't they go back to using horses? Well, because you used to spend more time raising grain to feed the horses. Than you did, raising grain to sell just to feed those horses. So that tractor basically replaces all those teams behind him, whatever, which is a pretty telling thing. Nobody's ever talking about going back in time that way, but some guys actually still farm with horses just because they like it, but not very many. And then the other thing is rather telling from that DuPont piece of propaganda or whatever from their nice publication is this right here. This is what they're going for. And during the 70s, especially late 60s, 70s, there were a number of councils, there were a number of foundations that did these research projects working hand in hand with the government, looking at, well, how can we improve the quality of life of the rural population? Because up to that time, many people, were only getting electricity in the 50s. People were not considered to be, up to par with their urban neighbors. They didn't have the same things that they had. They weren't, let's say, didn't have the quality of life that people had. Well, look at this. I mean, this is Burkholder, all the farm products that now he has access to. This is like a 100-acre farm. And these are all the chemicals that they piled up that he uses to produce what he produces during the course of a year, and as well look at all the household items that they can now have access to over there. His wife is proudly showing. So this is basically, I think, what you can look at the history of farming in the United States, and this is like kind of where the beginnings of that are midway to where we are today. And the other thing I have to mention too, when you bring up this idea of nitrogen, well, back in the day when people had more diversified farms, and this is a simple drawing of it, but people did a thing called a rotation, and didn't have to have soybeans in it, but they could have other crops as well. But one thing you definitely had to have in it was you had to have some forage crops, which is hay. Hay is a general term for many different types of forages. But basically that's a way of giving the land a rest, soil a rest, and actually returning some organic matter and nitrogen back to the soil. Because one thing you have to know about corn is a huge, huge user of nitrogen. There's plenty of nitrogen in the air, but it's of absolutely no use to us. It has to be in the soil, and it's usually brought there now artificially by nitrogen that we import from, in many cases, Russia, but there's a number of countries in the world that make it. Russia is actually a big producer of nitrogen, and that's made using natural gas. It's a huge energy input that you cannot grow corn without if you do not have another way, right, natural way of creating that, or through either livestock waste. People had cattle. Every farm had 25 milk cows, or at one point back even into the 60s, people started to get bigger. But all that manure went right onto your fields. Yeah, we still even do that on our farm. We still have cattle. We have a small operation. We make hay. We have rotation. We're at least going back to it now. So, but that's an important point to remember when you think about the cost. Again, the cost of raising all that corn.
Rotate crops now, the big guys? No?
I can show you fields that have been in continuous corn for 25 years. One of the biggest demographic changes, of course, then was just this decline of rural population. And again, I won't do too much on this, but one of the big important pieces of this that you have to think about is this. It really was just going to gradually larger farms and concentration of more wealth, more, and specialization as well, where you've got these big farms say, well, we're just going to raise corn. People identify themselves now as, we're corn farmers. People will say that. Oh, we mainly raise beans. Most people will identify themselves as corn farmers. So they're identifying with a specific commodity, in other words. And obviously less diversification. And the other thing that most people don't know is that when you go out in these rural areas, it's pretty old population. Well, so there aren't many kids out there. These 4-H clubs, remember, you guys know what 4-H clubs are. It's really hard to get a 4-H club together out there when you've got 60-year-old people living out there mainly. The kids have all left. They don't have. The kids have all left and they're living in the city or the suburbs somewhere. But we're down from a peak of from almost 7 million people living on farms. At one time, a huge portion of the United States population lived on farms. But what's interesting when they talk about now, there's a number of schools like set up, like for the ag school for ag sciences here in Chicago, and there's programs for young people to get into this. Well, what is huge actually is what they call the non-farm ag sector, which is millions of people working in that. But that's processing foods. That's actually working in the transportation, all the industries around the production itself, but not on the farms themselves. Yeah. And this is actually something I had known about, but I went back and I looked this up or whatever. 93, the government actually just decided, it's really not even worth surveying these people anymore, which is kind of telling. There's just not enough people out there living on the farms, So we actually can talk about, something called the depopulation of the rural landscape. When you drive out there, you may see houses, but the person living in a house is it could be a renter, could be somebody, the house is sitting empty. That kind of a thing, So it's basically concentration of land and resources in the hands of fewer and fewer people, and also with social change, especially when you look at small towns, and you think these abandoned farms. Eventually, people will tear those down because they're paying taxes on those. One thing that people don't want is paying higher taxes on the real estate on a barn or a building. It's easier just to burn it or bury it. Tear it down, or like I live in a town, Mount Carroll, where we used to have 3 elevators, and we don't have a single elevator anymore. They just went out of business. So people just don't need these things anymore. So you talk about these small rural, towns or whatever, kind of look like ghost towns, and I was reading something the other day. Someone said that they're filling them up with like antique stores. And he said, well, it's almost as though this is again something somebody else wrote, not me, but they said it's almost as though the products that people had at one time out here don't have any value anymore. The only thing they have left is to sell their history. So it's rather interesting. Look at this transformation. And then we kind of put that up against something I have to talk about, and that's this lobby for big agriculture, because it is huge. And right at the top of the list, and are there any Farm Bureau members in here? Because I'm going to stop talking right now. I have to go home and see people. I'll tell you, and the Farm Bureau is an old organization, but it's almost always been kind of linked up with larger farmers, with business, and has always been sort of on their side. And there have been a number of smaller farm organizations that kind of come back and forth, but they leave. Yeah.
Does the NFO exist?
That's a good question. I should know that. It does. But it's far fewer. That was smaller farmers. The National Farmers Organization were sort of the bad boys of of agriculture. They were the ones that would hold withholding actions and dump milk. They were protests, things like that. And it was they were the first ones that tried to do collective bargaining, like marketing, people their products together and get a better price, things like that. I think they're still around, but boy, you don't really read much about them anymore. And then, of course, there's American corn growers, there's the Iowa corn growers, and these are all lobbying groups. And again, if you start looking for information about ethanol, you're going to get an earful from these guys, because it is great. But the other thing is that this is also linked to this federally subsidized system we have for price supports and for what some people refer to as farmer welfare, which really isn't that. It's basically it's linked to a big system of just keeping farmers from going broke, kind of protecting them from the uncertainties of markets. But especially when you look at biofuel production, you'll see that they're talking about billions of dollars. And also, the other thing is we see are these cash payments to family corporations and individual farmers as well that are also in the billions as well. Again, if there's any Farm Bureau members in here, I just forget I even brought this up. So it's interesting. About 2 months, no, wait a minute. I guess it was February. I was out at home, and I got a call from the Farm Bureau office in our county. And my mother answered the phone, and they asked if I could maybe come and give them a talk about what I'd been doing. And they under the impression I had been a missionary in South America. Boy, were they wrong. But and so the thing is, I did end up going and giving them a talk. And I tell you the truth, I did talk about South America and experiences working in other countries, because that's really what they wanted to hear. And I did actually have quite a bit of information on climate change issues and linkages with U.S. agriculture. I chickened out completely. I couldn't do it. I couldn't talk to them about it. I just chickened out. I mean, I couldn't do it to them. There's older people, they're retired farmers. Many of them knew my parents. I just chickened out. I just talked about the easy stuff, like, here's a village, and yeah.
They found recently they're very, very wealthy.
Well, yeah, this is a whole other subject for a whole other talk as well. I'm just going to relate it. And in my county, there's a number of things that the government does. They do low-income loans. They can give cost sharing on conservation practices. You can get a loan on putting up a corn bin, all sorts of things. But they have another thing called LDP payments. These are loan deficiency payments. I won't go into this, except that what they do is they make up the difference in the cash price you get. It's a price that's set for each county at your local elevator, if you have one, whatever, and you can actually ask to get that just as a cash payout for the difference. And it could be 50 cents a bushel, depending on the price fluctuations or whatever, and people get these. There's a lot, it's rather interesting because people have always known about these. Also, the operator of the farm, the person who's farming it, gets it, not the owner. That's the person who actually. And some family farms in the U.S. And again, boy, now we're getting into a whole other thing. What's a farm? What's a family farm? Boy, that's complicated too. There's all these weird categories, and it's all based on income levels. And I have something I can show you at the end of this if you want to know more. But basically, the top 10% of the beneficiaries of LDP payments receive 66% of what's given out each year. So it's pretty. They're talking about some millionaires out there. Especially in they're kind of all focused on California, Southern California, but all over the United States. Yeah. we're talking about some pretty big money here. And the other big one that I think Sabine also talked a little bit about was CRP. And CRP has good intentions. It's a way to control the market fluctuations a little bit by taking land out of production, and also for environmental concerns as well, conservation. And everybody has some CRP land. We have, this is again our map of our farm, and you see those, this is a typical map. Every farm in the United States has you can walk into your county office, your ASCS office, that's the Agricultural Stabilization and Conservation Service, and they will show you what you've got listed for your acreages, what you, basically each year you're supposed to certify what you have, what you've got planted, who's farming it, that kind of a thing. And we have a number of smaller fields, and especially areas near water where we have streams. We have a creek going through our place, and we protect that creek by a set-aside as well. And so these are 10-year programs. You get paid depending what you bid. You can get different rates for that. I have them down here at the bottom. The focus is on trying to take land that's highly erodible. These are on slopes, steeper slopes, places where there is a real, even most danger of erosion, taking those out of production, putting them in a 10-year program where you just leave that sit with a cover crop. You're supposed to maintain it. You're supposed to mow it, keep weeds off of it. So it isn't like you just can't sit on anything. There are people who buy farms and they put their farm right into the program immediately, and they never farm it at all. That happens, of course. People will do that. There's no law that says you can't do that. And the other thing is that the rates that you are paid can be less than what you could make if you were raising corn on it or soybeans, or they could be the same, or they could be more. It just depends. And so something happened just recently with the ethanol craze that just went through. Whatever was, people started asking the government. There's a big lobby right now to let people go out of the program, get out of their contracts without penalty. Right now, if you're in the program, they penalize you pretty severely for going out. Well, they're basically all these guys were like, yeah, we want to raise more corn. Let us go out of the program. They're talking about almost like an ecological disaster, because many of these lands are highly erodible lands that probably shouldn't be farmed, anyway. And many people were just saying they should not do that. They should not give in and let these farm groups, get that, whatever. So make them stick to it. But anyway, some people may go out of the 10-year program anyway. And here, this is one of the coolest things I'll show you today. Right here, this is great. The secret's out. I just wrote that there. But this environmental working group worked on this, and basically there have been some lawsuits about this because a lot of the farm groups are upset about this. Because you can go onto this website, it's the Farm Subsidy database, and you can look what people are getting paid in your county. This is like reading somebody's mail. I mean, for a little while that we had it at home, my mother actually had the internet, and I was like, Mom, what are you looking at? Oh, look here, I'm seeing what so-and-so is making. I'm like, oh, man. This is like something that they do not want people to know. This is, anybody here know the Tautses? Because I'll stop right here. My neighbors, big farmers will farm all around us. Anybody here? Because I'll stop talking right now. I'll just go on. Okay. All right. So the Touts boys farm all around us, big farmers, whatever. And look at there. Look what they're pulling down, huh? Look at that over the course of a few years. Couple mil. There. Now again, they're making money selling their product as well. This is a subsidy. This is gravy on top. Now, a lot of the research is they're looking at this very closely, is that, okay, number one, too, is they're saying, well, we could just give them the money just flat out and there wouldn't be connected with any government program, whatever kind of a thing. Oh, I guess they could do that too. This makes it look a little bit better because it's supposedly a way to prop up markets and keep farmers from going as businesses. But at the same time, what are they doing with that money? What do you think they're doing? They're buying other land. They're buying other people out. They're getting bigger. Sure they are. Sure they are. And the other thing that this working group went and looked at was they looked at the zip codes that are linked to these, and they're looking at how much people are making over what, like, say, average incomes are for those zip codes. You got a county like ours, you got people that are making $20,000 a year, barely getting by, and you got people who are pulling down, extra money on top of what they're already making. So it's wealth on top of wealth in a way. But anyway, so this is a neat website. If any of you know any, just don't say it came from me. Don't mention me. And again, like I say, if anybody, don't mention anything to the Touts boys about this, because I don't want to have to, get some dirty looks when you drive by them on the road there, see them across the fence. So. Yeah, it's touchy. This is really touchy stuff. Yeah, it really is out there. And again, I'm going to run down through this. By the way, are there any questions up till now? I've just touched on a whole bunch of little weird things, yeah.
When the Farm Bureau invited you to come talk, I mean, you're talking to people.
They thought I was going to talk about being a missionary in South America. Yeah.
So these are people who are very close to the land. I mean, they must have some kind of affection for, the integrity of the soil, et cetera, but maybe not. I mean, I'm wondering, is the culture such that the bottom line is what's important here?
That's right.
And it's all very well good to talk about being good stewards of the land, but, the competition is competition. I have to do
That's right.
this. I mean, is that the culture?
That is the culture. And that's basically, it's the trade-off that people have, everybody needs.
There's examples in Argentina where they have sustainable farming with cattle and then growing grass, and how they manage to make it very profitable. So they've experimented alternative systems to make it more sustainable. Is there any reception?
I'll talk a little bit about that at the end. There's not. And it's because the people just don't have the motivation yet. Where I'm from, to go into more sustainable. We talked a little bit about carbon market. And thinking about getting payment for carbon sequestration and things like that. People have heard of that, of course they have. But they're making too much money on the waste. There's no economic reason for them to do that. I mean, now they'll do it. I would say they'll do it if somebody just decides to pay them for something they're already doing anyway.
Remove subsidies.
Right. Well, that's the thing. But when subsidies, you talk about political parties and
yeah, the thing about subsidies again is like it's as much the Democrats as it is the Republicans. You can't, boy, that's like a sacred cow. You're looking for trouble if you start talking about pulling away subsidies. It's a tough one. Yeah. Yeah, and again, what's people's motivation for doing something different? Right now, people are happy. I mean, they're making money. They have been making money. Nobody's really suffering. So, yeah. Anyway, yeah.
You're talking about grain subsidies.
Right on the big marketable grains. Yeah, they don't have subsidies for tomatoes. Yeah. Why don't they? I don't know. I don't have an answer for that. There's a guy, this Michael Pollan. Actually, I think he almost always starts off every argument about that. He says, "How come we don't have, equal government support for other commodities, other farm products, than for grain, wheat, soybeans, sugar? You know what I mean? Those are the big ones, and because there's nobody advocating for it. Apparently, that has I would guess there's no power behind it. I guess." Look at the system I just showed you that's built up about those commodities. You don't think you're going to change, you know what I mean? Like I say, that's a train. That's something that's on its way. It's difficult to derail that train, I would think. And again, ethanol is like a whole nother world. And like I said, you can find one website that'll say one thing, and you'll find another website that says the exact opposite. Facts and figures are really getting thrown out right and left. It did start to take off here with this 20 and 10 thing that George Bush had talked about. This independence from gasoline and 20% decrease in 10 years, and that really and there's been a number of different energy policies that have been put in place. It's also especially linked to the last farm bill, and what it kind of is generally that's going on is there is a worldwide shift to this idea of biofuels. And it's not just from corn, but there's actually a huge interest in, especially this thing, soy diesel. Soy diesel actually is from soybeans, and it's actually you can power pretty much a tractor off of it. And what's interesting about that, it was driven first by farmers themselves. Is it has anyone heard of a magazine called Farm Show out there? It's about farm innovation, but it's about like people being like their own crazy inventor in the barn. They're trying things out. It's great magazine. It's about farm innovation. It's about people trying things out, experimenting with machinery. But there was a whole issue about a year ago that was all like on-farm production of fuel, and you can people make their own little soy diesel machines or whatever out of an old water heater or what, I don't know what, but it's amazing that there's interest in that. And what's funny about that, there was a case back in the early 80s when ethanol's been around for a while. There's been people lobbying for ethanol production for some years. It's not exactly new. And there was actually a farmer-driven kind of a movement towards ethanol production on farm back in the early 80s. It never really went anywhere. The idea was that farmers could produce their own fuel, just with their excess corn. There was so much corn, rather than give it away, sell it for nothing, burn it in your house, and people were doing that, but they were also experimenting with making ethanol too. So it's not exactly a new idea. Plus, there's also the oil crop issue, which is more palm oil, things in Southeast Asia, and that's like a whole other talk as well. If somebody wants to get into that, what's going on in South Asia with these big plantations for palm oil. That's an ecological disaster taking place on its own that nobody hardly knows about. And then there's the cellulosic production, which people do know a little bit about. And the question would be, where are these fuels, where are they going to come from? The cellulosic thing is rather interesting because these are like based on prairie plants or grasses that actually have more energy in them, but it's just like the production process isn't there to actually get anything out of them. But you don't have actually the erosion that you have with these plants as you do with corn or soybeans. People know about it, but it's kind of way behind everything's geared up for making ethanol right now. And for everybody, kind of a retooling thing maybe. I'm not really quite sure, but people do know about this. And basically, they're also saying too that if they started doing this, that would also compete with the food supply as well. So this is still the same issue: is that what you're going to use basically you go back to what you're going to use your land for. And then there's elephant grass, switchgrass. Nearly all the universities in the Midwest are experimenting. They all have plots, with these grasses, whatever. They're trying to, work on the production side and experimenting with, trying to get fuel out of them, or, So that's coming. But one thing that, again, this is, my own personal opinion. If there's somebody in here from the Farm Bureau that wants to step up, can say differently. But the one thing that I've been the science and the economics both don't really make sense. And the other thing is, if you really think about this, it's an ethical issue as well. That I think that if you talk about this with students, is show them some facts or show them some things and let them come to that conclusion for themselves. Because when it comes down to it, without the subsidies, without that, as much as 82 cents a gallon, it's just not going to, stand up to being competitive with gasoline alone. So, it doesn't make sense. And the other thing is that you've got very few, gas stations in the United States that even sell that E85, which is the straight ethanol, and more ethanol. And then it's just a huge business on its own that has sort of a life of its own, the way I understand it. It's very difficult to stop it now.
Obama dropped the hydrogen fuel.
He did? Yeah. And I was going to say is that one of the things obviously everybody knew about, but and again, you can go to the Illinois corn growers. I remember actually hearing interviews on the radio where saying, "Oh no, you're not going to see an increase in food prices." Nobody wanted to see anything bad about this ethanol, like use. They just completely denied it. And in fact, it actually even affected actually cattle producers, because people who had feedlots, they were finishing out cattle, they use corn for that. Well, basically, you have nothing but a bunch of empty feedlots here in the Midwest now. There's hardly anybody who has any cattle on feed. People have been talking about the advantages of grass-fed beef. Well, you're going to only see grass-fed beef from now on, pretty much. That's the only thing there's going to be. It's going to be pretty rare to find anybody feeding any expensive corn to an animal anymore. But anyway, it did definitely. There were a lot of cases where if you knew anybody who works in like a bakery or like I do, or they saw increases in all their products that they buy. And there were even like food riots or not riots, but demonstrations in Mexico, because it immediately affected the price of some of the basic foodstuffs in Mexico. But again, when everything I still read, it says there's more plants being built. A lot of these ethanol plants, some like 45%, some 50%, some like are farmer owned as well. So in other words, these guys have an interest in those plants. Yeah, they're going to grow more food for that market. They're farmer owned ethanol plants throughout the United States. Actually talking about this year, they're going to actually boost the corn production to 90 million, something like that. They estimate 90 million acres planted to corn. And everybody says, this kind of comes up, a lot of things I was reading, and it's true. What happens if we have a drought? What happens if we have a disaster? We had last disastrous drought we had was, I think, in 89? No, wait a minute here. 89. Yeah, we had 3 months there without rain. It was dry. Yeah. I saw alfalfa go to seed for the first time, because plants go to seed just before they die. I'd never seen that. We always made hay before that. But corn was just, corn never got much harder than, your waste. Everything just dries up. We could have that. And not only that, when you think about this, They talk about world grain stocks. And it's rather interesting. I kind of ran into this by accident. I was reading about something else, and I saw this. And basically, we can have adverse, as they say, crop events, which are disasters, due to climate, change or climate, conditions, whatever, anytime. And there are a lot of them going on right now. One thing most people don't know about this incredibly long drought that they've been having in Australia. It basically devastated their wheat growing area. It's been for like 9 years or something like that. People are just like walking off the land and leaving. It's that serious. It's a huge, huge problem. So we can have these disasters, and this will definitely affect, right, the price of corn. The overall, as they say, the world grain stock, that we have available to take care of problems in other countries. Yeah. And there's another thing I just happened to, this is completely by accident, I didn't even know about this, but there's this new wheat rust that's moving around. And one of the things that they're saying, it's going to travel. It's this global, communication, transportation system we have. Somebody's going to bring it to the United States. It's going to happen. And so they're working feverishly on developing some new hybrid strains to actually combat this thing. But unfortunately, they have to go back to lower yielding strains of wheat. They, in other words, won't have the same, won't yield as much, to be able to fight this thing off. But it's coming. I didn't even know about this, and apparently it's huge too. Wheat stem rust. Yeah, there's a lot of diseases out there that can go around. We have them in our corn crop and our soybean crop too. There's a soybean rust actually. It's a problem in Asia right now as well. And so the reality is more global demand. On top of this, car drivers want more fuel. They want to drive their cars. Yeah. And they're estimating that probably 5% of all cereal crops in the world, 9% of all oil crops will eventually go into those biofuels. And they're talking about probably this will represent half of all new land. In other words, these are marginal lands, these new forested areas, timbers, that kind of, even here in the United States. I've seen people bulldoze 16-acre, 20-acre timbers down for cornfields. There's timbers I used to hunt in when I was a kid, and it's just a hilltop, it's all corn. And then what I was going to say is that when you think about, there's a couple of issues with land use and environmental damage, when we look at the landscape. And one of the big ones is really erosion. And they have this thing they call the T factor, the tons per acre issue. And we know that we're probably losing soil. It's like some people say there's going to be a 20% increase just simply because of the ethanol market alone. It's been driven, and so. But that's a very difficult thing to measure. Also, these are all estimates. And one thing is you'll always find. I actually worked a lot when I was in Iowa on soil erosion and working with farmers, understanding how what they thought about it. Why most people would say, well, I don't have any erosion problem. It's because it's basically something, unless you have these great big giant ditches, most people would not think that they have any, but there are lots of different types of erosion spread out over a field. But you're talking about tons, of loss per inch. And so I was going to say this too, and this is what the real factor is. How much rain did we get the other day? 19th. Paris, Illinois got 4.6 inches. My brother, I talked to him on the phone the other night. That's a lot of rain on unprotected. I mean, the corn's only this high right now. So most of that landscape, most of that soil is sitting there, and they got rows about this wide, 30-inch rows, something like that. That's unprotected soil that's being hit by, incredible volume of water that there's nothing there to hold it back. Soil's already saturated with water. We've had enough rain. There's plenty of moisture right now. Yeah, we got 4 inches at home. And this is called accelerated erosion. Erosion's a natural process. Yeah, but what we are doing by our agricultural practices is we are actually creating accelerated erosion, which is we're basically helping, more soil erode at a faster rate than it normally would. Most people say a loss of 4 tons of soil to the acre is replaceable, it's acceptable. Most people don't really believe that, but that's what they go for. I mean, the United States goal for the Soil Conservation Service tried to get people down to 4 tons. Most people are really more probably up in the 20-ton per acre range. Most people aren't using soil conservation practices like they should. Actually, what I put over there, something else. Oh yeah, I like this one. This is back in March. We had a big rain at the end of February. Rained for like 3 days, hard. I went around and I took some pictures or whatever up in our cornfield. What's great about this, we have these great big ditches. They can't even drive their combines through like some of these ditches that we have now up in our cornfields on these hills. When my cousins started farming, does anybody here know the Dolphins, my cousins? Because I'll just stop right here. Okay, when they started farming our place, when they started, they're relatives, we can't say too much, right? But they basically farmed right through all the waterways, all the soil conservation practices that we had in place for like 25, 30 years. And, they're renters, they can do what they want, but we weren't happy about it, but nobody said anything, they're relatives. What's great about it is they also get a nice subsidy from the, I can go on that website and look and see how much they're getting as well. He's getting a subsidy from the government to actually erode my land. So, yeah. A personal note. Don't anybody go back there and tell them what I've been saying about him, please. I'll never be able to, So we are losing one of our natural resources, our soil. This is just around us. This is my neighbors, whatever. And what people do is you see the bulldozer up there, the crawler. People try to go and like push the ditches back in and then they just wash right back out. And this guy actually they have something. You can kind of see at the top. There's a top of a grain bin. That's called a push-up terrace, where you actually put a terrace up and there's like you try to control the flow of water through there through a number of, like a system of pipes, and so the water drains for what actually had so much rain it pushed the whole terrace out, actually. And that's another thing that happens. It actually ruins these conservation structures that they put in, which are very expensive. So. Yeah, and this is right behind our barn. Again, another personal note. This is just from the other night. I talked to my brother, and we have to have a water. This is up through our pasture. This area drains a very, very large area back to the east of us, and very few of those people have any waterways, anything. The whole water. So basically, this is just like a running, like an outlet for all the water strains. I don't know how many acres over to the east of us, whatever. And he said the other night, this is all gone again. After we just put another tube back in, we haul dirt in from somewhere else, whatever. This is the third time this year. You know what I mean? So I'm getting tired of this. So we're going to have to do something here. I don't know.
Are you supposed to put another plant in with that corn? How could they prevent this erosion?
Well, if they had some kind of a cover crop, yeah. Right, you're asking how could you prevent erosion. Be honest with you, if you're planting corn, you're planting some of these crops, it's very, very difficult to prevent erosion. Right. You have to have some kind of a cover crop if you can. The one thing that you can do is you can try to leave more residue on the surface of the ground. And all land has erosion. Even land that's fairly level has erosion. So it isn't just on things that are on slopes. So, question? Yeah.
You build ponds. So you cultivate the pond.
Yes, you can. In fact, what I'm going back to here was one thing we're going to go back into the government and try to get some government assistance to build a retention pond above us. So basically, then there'll be like a dike or another area above us which will catch all that water and let it out at a slower rate. So basically, it doesn't wash out our tubes and our bridge, behind our barn. So, yeah, and that's something that the government has a big interest in. And to tell you the truth, they wouldn't be interested in it right now to help us with any kind of cost sharing, other than the fact that there's a feedlot. There's some people that do have cattle above us, and the one thing that the government's concerned about, and this is huge, is nitrogen coming down these waterways, down these water systems, and into the Mississippi River and into the Gulf of Mexico. So they're going backwards, and they're starting to go up at this level, right, and start to actually to try to control some of this runoff that's basically loaded up with nitrogen, also with herbicide residue such as atrazine. But this is a new thing that they're asking people to cooperate in this. So we want this help. So we're talking about above us, they're building a whole structure. And again, that's a picture of our farm, and you see basically there's one big farm. These probably were in the old days. These were around us. Trying to see. Here's our farm. Well, that's basically there was a farm here. This was a separate farm. That was a separate farm. That's a separate farm. That's a separate farm. That's a separate farm, and those are all owned by one person now. We're surrounded by someone all just only raises corn pretty much, and some of that shouldn't really be farmed. All that water, where I was showing you just now, where we're looking up this valley, all that water that drains down through here comes down these valleys. There's really nothing there to hold it back. There's no water control, waterways, anything. There's nothing there. Especially right now, the first few months of the production season, after people plant corn, or when we get these gully washers, when we get 4 inches of rain in a day, there's just no way that you can hold that amount of rain back. So, All right, and so again, we're just talking about, we're talking about soil erosion rates that are like at the level of the Great Depression. When they had the Dust Bowl. Everybody knows these photos. Whatever. But that's for a different. That's wind erosion, and those are out west. We're talking about people losing. In some cases, that state of Iowa has lost like half its topsoil. Something like that. We're talking about incredible amount of environmental devastation happening just because we're growing too much. Product on it just can't replace itself. What's that? Yeah, what's that? Oh, sure, I can. Yeah, and again, these are all these are all pretty much boilerplate. These are standard figures for soil loss. Nobody can really argue with these. But soil loss is really difficult to measure. Like I say, you can stand out in the field and it won't look like you're losing anything. It's very, very difficult to persuade farmers, that they have an erosion problem. They'd rather just not address it, And again, there's conservation measures. You can do no-till. There's things you can leave more residue, but really, it really doesn't help. And again, this is a cool website that I found. Go to the Museum of Science of Minnesota website, and they have one of the best interactive little websites. It's just one cell from it or screen from it, but it explains this whole. Look at really one of the best things I've seen with this drainage system through the Midwest and down the Mississippi. Those are all farm fields basically that are draining into one place and creating this huge dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. It's just getting bigger. I mean, look at some of the satellite images of that area, and it's just a huge,
Gulf of Mexico water.
Yeah, right. And so the government is very, very concerned about this, and that's why they're going backwards and they're starting to go up to the sources for this. So there's actually a lot of money right now to do research on water quality in some of these small streams around farm fields, things like that. And again, rented, this is another issue I have to just mention real quick, is rented cropland. There's a lot of renters out there. People get old, they get retired, they move off the farm. They want to, one of the number one rules is people that own land, you never sell it if you don't have to. People hang on to it forever and ever. It passes on the family. The kids rent it out to somebody else. But some of the best cropland in the United States is actually rented. And what's your incentive for a renter to put in conservation practices, to take land out of production, to put waterways in, to get a lower yield? When you're renting it, you're paying, in some cases, over $200 an acre now. Farm rent for corn ground went from like $110, $120. Now it's like $225, $230 in many areas of Illinois.
The sale price.
What's that?
Sale price. Is that gone up?
Oh, for land? The ethanol market created inflation. Sure, it did. Sure, the price of land. It's kind of leveled off a little bit. Yeah, but there aren't many farms to sell. Number one, people just aren't selling them they're hanging on to them. So, yeah. But anyway, so in other words, renters it's a problem. When I worked for the government back in the late 70s, early 80s, I actually had access to a lot of these figures from my own county, and I was shocked at how many people lived in Texas and California. You go back and you look, and they're basically relatives of someone who it's inherited land, but the thing is, it stays in the family, and they rent it out to someone. That's very common in the United States. Half the farmland's rented. Yeah. So real quickly, I'm going to finish up with this. How are we doing on time? Yeah, okay. And I had to get to this because we said I wanted to talk a little bit about South America. And this is something I became aware of a while back, and I finally found some information about this. And this was this idea that we can have ripple effects due to the market, the changes in our practices here in the United States, changes in markets. And they call these indirect impacts as well. And one thing we definitely know is that when farmers here in the United States responded to the need for more corn due to the ethanol market, is that immediately producers in other countries see that, and there's the demand for soybeans is still going to stay the same. People are going to, okay, I'm not going to plant so much for soybeans this year, I'm going to plant more corn. Well, basically what happens is that we saw this especially it's been proven, you can't really deny it because they can look at the satellite photos, is what happened in Brazil. And basically what they look at, there's a number of ways, and there's some really interesting websites you can go to look for, and you can actually see, for example, these are fire counts. In other words, these are areas that are being cleared in the Amazon in Brazil. And most of this is actually newer newer fields that are being cleared for soybean production. And what's interesting, again, if you understand irony a little bit, is that, the United States, basically, our model for soybean production is something that we helped Brazil develop. I mean, I think back into the 60s or whatever, and, my father did work for the Extension Service. We had people from Brazil all the time visiting us. We knew people from Brazil. When I was even still at Iowa State, I knew probably a dozen people who worked for the Brazilian soybean research service or whatever, that kind of a thing. It's huge. Soybeans, are really something for Brazil that it was a government policy. They're just going to grow more of it for the world market, and they will respond like this. So there are those connections or whatever. They definitely saw in 2007 this increase in soybean production, and I actually made up a little graphic when I heard about this. And one thing that's interesting, just prior to this, Brazil was getting all these. People were congratulating them on what a great job they had done of actually lowering their deforestation rate. In the previous couple years, whatever. And next thing you know, due to the responding to the need for more soybeans for the world market or whatever, next thing you know, they're deforesting an area. I kind of figured it out. It'd be just like if you went kind of on the other side of where would that be, like St. Charles maybe or something like that, and you drove clear over into eastern Iowa and you didn't see a tree. Think about how hard that would be to chop all those trees down. We're talking about a really, really large area of the Amazon that's been deforested, just in basically for soybean production. Yeah. Now, is that our fault? Again, I really held off that day. That night I did that talk to the Farm Bureau people because I couldn't talk about this. I didn't want to. One thing you don't want to do in these discussions is make someone feel bad. I just can't do it. I just don't want to do it. Someone else could maybe go there and present this in a different way. And I think people would like to know and to discuss this, but I don't know exactly how to do it yet. I'm talking about this with rural people, But yeah, so you look at the satellite. These are really shocking images you see if you look at some of these or whatever. These are new fields being burned. Also, Brazil is sort of up at the top of this picture here. And what you see that's northern Bolivia, that's the border right there. Well, this is actually the other area of South America, which is quickly being, not necessarily all deforested. A lot of this is sort of kind of like lowlands, but it's not necessarily intact Amazonian rainforest, but it's still forest. And it's new lands that are being cleared for soybean fields in Bolivia. Basically what Bolivia did in the central area around Santa Cruz, if any of you know that area, they've adopted the Brazilian model for monocropping, which is based on soybean production as well. And they actually are not really a factor like Brazil is, in terms of the international market, but they're going there. Anyway, so these are pretty shocking. So in other words, and of course, what happens when you think about this, it's not even just the energy that you expend while you're growing a crop, so on, but it's the energy that you've expended while you're clearing that forest as well. And basically, this all ties into this, this idea that you're just releasing more carbon into the atmosphere. Right, and could, depending whether you believe Al Gore or not, could. That's really a good thing to go to the Farm Bureau with, is talk about Al Gore, whatever. I'm not going to try that, but and of course, we're talking about conversion of lots of land, not just for soybeans, but also for the cattle markets as well. And many times they actually, after the lands have been, especially in the case of in Bolivia, after they've cleared land for soybean production, they actually revert back to pasture for cattle, which is even, fewer people, benefiting from that. You get. And these are really ecologically fragile lands as well. You're talking about 4 or 5 years of production. In many cases, you're just creating more poverty because often in Brazil especially, poor people move onto those lands and try to just carve out a living out of what's left, what little fertility is left in some of these lands. So anyway, we got, again, just to sum up, that current generation of biofuels is produced from the current food crop and feed crops. There's a threat to food security, you could easily say, and there's deforestation, there's contamination, lots of it, because Monsanto is a huge player, and they have a whole other company that works just down in South America and is based in Brazil as well. But you're talking about huge amounts of farm chemicals used, just like they are here. And that increased demand is probably going to be in the tropics. We can also increase some land production here in the United States, but we're a little limited in that. So is this the way forward? That's a shocking photo I found in Brazil, the scale that they're operating at. Here farmers have one combine, they're pretty proud of that, but here you got these huge companies that are, have these huge farms in the Amazon. And we got some choices to make. Maybe some of you have seen this before. I've showed it somewhere else. But this idea, this is something good to try to visualize this, for students especially, is the idea, what's a bushel of corn worth in terms of its fuel? It's, okay, well, how we got some trade-offs here. We got some choices to make. Can we feed people, through that somehow, either through, nobody eats corn directly. That's always cited every time you look at these statistics. Well, people don't actually eat the corn, but they use it in many other ways. It's in many products, and it also is used to feed livestock as well. You're talking about filling up a tank of an SUV, something like that for, what you get out of that bushel. Or the other way I saw here was you can drive a car at 60 miles an hour. You just went through a bushel of corn. Corn weighs 56 pounds, roughly. Or this way, the cost. Look at 1 gallon of ethanol. And man, I'll tell you, I put that up there because, wow, the internet is just full of different figures for how much water you use to make a gallon of ethanol. It ranges from anywhere from 4 to 10. I've seen 2 all the way up to 1,000. And it's like amazing. Okay, what is it? It's just, just like the same figure goes for how much more energy does it take to produce a gallon of ethanol than you get out of it. And some people say it's 40%. Some people say there's a gain. It's all over the place. You don't know what to believe. But especially you even think about how much soil we're going to lose per gallon. They're talking about, at least 20 pounds of soil per gallon, something like that figures. So we got those choices to make, here, and, we can help people in other countries make decisions as well. And the other thing I just going to mention real briefly here in the United States is we talk about where's that new farmland going to come from. We're actually using up farmland for other purposes, especially development, urbanization, at a higher rate than what we can make up for through higher production figures. We can always grow more corn. We can always put more fertilizer on, right? We can use, crop improvements. We can, but we're not going to just make any more land necessarily easily unless we start going after all the little nooks and crannies and of timber, that kind of a thing. So we've got a lot of growth here in the Chicago area alone. Yeah, and the rate of loss of farmland is actually increasing, exponentially here in Illinois, especially compared to other states. And do I have like a minute or so, something like that? Yeah, we're a couple of minutes. It's worth bringing this out because I actually get asked by this. Well, what about local food? It's a fair question. Actually, how many of you know about this? They just passed this new bill, this Illinois, what do they call it, the Food Farms Jobs Act, which is basically trying to put more emphasis on local production of food for people here in the state and whatever. And it's true. I mean, a tiny percentage of what we spend on food actually comes from within the state. And there's other names for that movement. It's a good thing. I just don't know much about it. I hear about it. I know a lot of people that kind of are working this. I know a lot of people that work in the restaurant business here in Chicago and so on. And I just don't know very much myself. But it would be nice if we had more, obviously, local food go into schools, to people who need to eat healthier, more nutritious food. But, from what I've seen, and everybody keeps talking about, it's just really expensive. I mean, how are you going to bring the cost down? Because, and again, when you talk about this out where I'm from with people on farms, people are like, well, wait a minute, we're grain farmers. There is nobody out there who wants to get off of a tractor seat and go down and start raising vegetables. They're just not going to do it. People are just too biased, and they do one thing. They're set up. We have a system that's set up for just really one thing. It's raising. Again, it's a specialty for them. It's a specialization. They raise large amounts of corn, soybeans, some hay, livestock. They aren't vegetable farmers. That's for somebody else. That's a bunch of hay. It's for a bunch of organic hippie farmers or something. People tend to discount it. And they have people that do this here, and some of them make a pretty good living off of it. But it's high labor, that kind of a thing. So. But it's interesting. It's worth a discussion. And I got some take-home messages, and these are, again, will be with the PowerPoint that you get online. that kind of a thing. And I was telling somebody about this talk the other day, and they were saying, well, what are you going to do? What can we do about it? And I was like, actually, tell you the truth, I really don't know. I'm not really sure. I think everybody has to go on their own and just make your own way. And I'm doing it in my own way. I'm going back to my own farm and seeing what I can do. And I don't even know what I'm gonna end up doing it myself. But I'm probably going to try to re-diversify, have a small grain and like a cattle farm. We're going to try to do some things. I may get some goats, which will really cause people hilarity out there. I want to try to raise some goats. And I'll tell you what, we see it coming. Anybody know about this? Funny, here in Chicago, I don't think it's all that well known, this conflict that's been going on out in Joe Davis County. You go right by here, it's Nora, Illinois, tiny, like, one of these typical 10 families, 15 families live in this little town. A California businessman, millionaire, they've got these huge dairies all over the place. They decided to move to northwestern Illinois because land is, cheap. And not only that, but they don't have to use irrigation to grow forage for their cattle, so it's cheaper for them. And basically, they built this huge dairy facility without really getting anybody's. They don't have to. They're private businessmen. You can buy land. You can do anything you want with it. That's the American way, right? Well, basically, they were talking about 10,000 cows, on this very, very small site. And people kind of living around there kind of said, wait a minute here. We've been living here. Farmers, small farmers living around there, homeowners. There's older people that they've lived there all their lives. They really don't want to move, because of a huge $10,000 farm. Well, he scaled it back to 5,000 cows. But basically, it's a huge conflict out there right now. And people are saying, keep away, go back to California. I mean, this is coming. I mean, and the thing is, how can you stop this, though? That's one thing, is that people buy land, they can have a right to do what they want with it, right? I mean, if they get the right permits. Kind of a thing. I think this is something that we're looking at more and more of, is that, the industrialization of, again, the dairy business. And, people can talk about they want to have healthy food. They want to drink milk that comes from small farms and doesn't pollute, pollute the environment, that kind of thing. But what are you going to do in the end? I mean, I think this is kind of almost unstoppable. Yeah.
Do you know what you think about the wind farm?
No. Only that I know some people that sell that up by Lena, actually not far from here, Lena, Illinois. And in my county, they're so wealthy, they're doing so well farming that nobody's interested. They can't actually get anybody in my county interested in it. So, yeah. In other areas, people are more. I don't know any more than that. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah. They're around. Everybody has. You're talking about genetically modified. And that's like a whole nother talk as well for somebody to talk about that issue, and especially the transnational part of that. How that gets into the food supply and that kind of a thing. And I'm not. I haven't talked about that very much with people who farm, near me or whatever. But it's around. And the big thing is you have this like Roundup Ready corn that you actually it's like designer crops now, and they're actually designer chemicals is actually the next thing, where you have chemicals that are specific to one weed. You're planting seeds that are basically you can use any kind of chemical. It doesn't hurt them. It's like a management thing for people that everybody actually welcomes. Because it's actually, they say it's making things cheaper, but at the same time, it's still another input, that people have. And it's not available to everybody either, because it's still, when you think about it, it's still costly. It's still expensive to put in an acre of corn. The price just went up because of the nitrogen that people put on. It's like almost a third of the total cost of an acre of corn. It's like $530 an acre, or something like that. So, yeah. Yep.
Is there any impact on climate change yet, or are you studying any future changes in climate change?
You mean here?
Yeah.
You know what? I haven't. I'm talking about climate change locally, like here. And again, I did have that talk with the Farm Bureau, and I was brave enough just to talk about climate change, but in other countries and other places. And but it's interesting to think about. If somebody wanted to, you could start to go look at rainfall figures. You could look at a number of factors or changes or things. Okay, what's different today than it was when 30 years ago or 50 years ago? And especially with an older group, like people you find in the Farm Bureau meetings, who have long memories. I remember years ago when we had our last drought in 89, 80, so whatever. And, boy, it was amazing how much people remembered about the last big drought, which was in the 30s, you know. I mean, they could remember specific details, and everybody was talking about that. But I mean, to kind of put it in context about maybe there are changes today, you know. But I think that they're just not thinking that way about climate change. They'd rather not think about it. And so, good. Thank you.